Let's be honest, Russia's military sucks. We were all told it was the second most powerful in the world, a global superpower, a force to fear. And then Ukraine happened. And suddenly the mighty Russian war machine started to look like a rusted-out relic from the Cold War. The truth? It was all smoke and mirrors. The tanks falling apart. The strategy stuck in the 1970s. The leadership corrupt and clueless. And the troops starving, surrendering, or worse. This isn't just failure, it's a full-blown military embarrassment, a humiliation for Putin, and it's unraveling in real time. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on Russia's military myth and showing you the receipts. Do you remember the headlines that struck every major news outlet in February 2022? The world watched in horror as Russian forces poured across Ukraine's borders in what was supposed to be a lightning-fast special military operation. According to Putin's calculations, which were even backed by some Western analysts on the first day, Kyiv would fall within days. Russian generals reportedly packed parade uniforms, expecting to march victoriously through the Ukrainian capital within 72 hours. As we know by now, that never ended up happening. While Russia did invade Ukraine and got as far as the outskirts of the Ukrainian capital, the initial invasion stalled spectacularly. Russian forces, despite overwhelming numerical superiority on paper, faltered and lost any momentum they might have had from the very start. The Institute for the Study of Wars analysis shows that Russia's initial campaign failed in its primary objective to conduct airborne and mechanized operations to seize Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and other major Ukrainian cities to force a change of government in Ukraine. Those reports came as early as April 2022, suggesting that the Kremlin needed to backtrack on the invasion goals only after a few weeks of fighting. Why did this supposedly world-class military stumble so badly? In practice, the actual scope of the invasion, with the initial military strategy, was bound to fail from the start. You see, the land invasion of Kyiv and the subsequent one in Donbass was the backdrop for an attempted coup of the entire Ukrainian government. The first critical battle of the war was not fought on any of the front lines between Kyiv and Moscow, but at the Kyiv airport. On the morning of the invasion, a small group of around 200 supposedly high-trained and expert elite forces were supposed to have been delivered by aircraft directly into the Hostomel airport, one of Ukraine's largest airports that was also only miles from the capital city center. The goal was to capture the airport using only air-inserted infantry, with aerial support provided by a sizable formation of 20 to 34 transport and combat helicopters. The operation aimed to establish an air bridge less than 10 kilometers from Kyiv, swift, bold, and dangerously close to the heart of Ukraine's capital. The next stage of the plan would involve a massive transport of troops from Moscow or St. Petersburg, with reports suggesting as many as 5,000 troops being prepped for transport. These troops would have direct access to Kyiv through the occupied airport, which used to comfortably land some of the world's largest planes, storming the Capitol building and taking over the government to allow Putin a seamless victory. But the initial takeover of the airport went horribly awry. The Ukrainian military, receiving vital intelligence of Russia's hostile movements, parked vehicles on the runway, preventing the first wave of Russian troops from landing. Instead, the helicopters were forced to land a few hundred yards away from the airport, all while being battered by human-portable Igla anti-aircraft missiles and a lone Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun, and suffering the first casualties in the form of at least 4 helicopters downed during the approach. The resulting battle between the Russian forces and Ukrainian ones went back and forth, which was entirely surprising given that the Russian troops were supposedly special forces, while the Ukrainian ones were conscripted. Nevertheless, the Russian troops occupied the airport, but only for a few hours after the projected timeline. By that time, the rest of the Russian military was experiencing its own delays. The mechanized infantry that started in Belarus was held up by the Ukrainian defenses and would only reach the airport the next day. The air transport that was supposed to come from Russia and reinforce the initial troops with those 5,000 men was recalled as there was nowhere to land. The Ukrainian mechanized infantry shelled the airport for good measure to make it utterly unusable to incoming Russian forces. The prelude to the invasion was only an indicator of things to come, but the underlying issues that made it a non-starter are spread through the entire military, which we'll delve into deeper. Take, for example, the widespread equipment shortages in the military, which would go counter to the country's ethos as having one of the most prepared militaries in the world. During the first days of the invasion, a 35-mile Russian convoy sat immobilized outside Kyiv. Yes, fuel and supply issues were a major factor, but they weren't the only reason. Ukrainian resistance, especially through drone strikes and ambushes, played a key role in grinding the convoy to a halt. This stalled advance was part of a larger mechanized force meant to seize the airport and spearhead the push toward the capital. And yet, this force, representing a country that exports more oil and gas than almost anyone on Earth, was left stranded on the road. To make matters worse, independent news outlets and viral social media posts soon showed Russian soldiers looting Ukrainian grocery stores for food. Why? Because some frontline troops were being issued military rations that had expired in 2015. According to NATO assessments, Russia vastly underestimated the logistical requirements for its ambitious three-pronged attack. Their supply chains collapsed almost immediately upon contact with reality. In military parlance, this isn't just a tactical failure, it's a fundamental breakdown of basic military planning. The Royal United Services Institute posited that the scope of the invasion far outmatched what the military could actually distribute. As such, the actual orders to invade Ukraine, alongside orders to provide rations, fuel, and equipment to the forces that would make up the first wave of the invasion, came only 24 hours before the invasion started. Caught unaware, the higher echelons in Russia's military scrambled to do what they could, which was little, leaving the bulk of the work to junior officers. In turn, those same officers didn't receive the training to deal with these issues in the first place, which also needs to be discussed. Perhaps you're thinking, okay, they had some supply issues, that happens in war, right? Sure, but what about the equipment they did manage to deploy? Russia was estimated to have some of the largest arsenals of tanks, artillery, and infantry support vehicles in the world. Military parades in Moscow over the years went to great lengths to showcase the progress of the Russian military-industrial complex. But as it turns out, much of Russia's touted modernization program was more smoke and mirrors than substance. Let's talk numbers. According to the Oryx intelligence group, which documents equipment losses with photographic evidence, Russia had lost over 1,000 tanks in only the first year of the war. By the end of the second year, that number rose to 2,800. That's more than the total number of tanks in active service in the entire British, French, and German armies combined at the time. A more recent estimate after the third completed year puts the count at a staggering 3,800 tanks. And that's only tanks. Between 2022 and 25, Russia lost over 12,000 armored combat vehicles in total. Sticking with the tanks for now, the main battle tanks Russia utilized were the T-90s and T-80s, both upgraded versions of Soviet-era designs and far more capable than what Ukraine fielded at the start of the invasion, the T-84 and the modernized T-64. But Ukrainian forces have destroyed, damaged, or captured hundreds of these modern tanks. So what happened? The modern tanks still shared some of the crucial weaknesses inherent in the Soviet designs, which aimed to reduce complexity, maintenance, and manpower requirements. A vital example was the autoloader system. While it meant the tank should be able to fire faster and not need a dedicated crew member to reload the main armament, the ammo storage on the tank ended up being unarmored. This would allow Ukrainian troops to directly target the storage with mines or drones, which could decimate the entire tank. However, some tanks were later found to have reactive armor blocks filled with rubber or cardboard instead of explosives. This would point to the actual manufacturing of the tanks being far behind its supposed goals, and that the rampant corruption and underfunding have led to Russia sending faulty or outdated equipment to the front line. The equipment issues were further highlighted by reports from early 2023 of Russia deploying Soviet-era T-62s and even older T-55 museum pieces. Footage and analysis suggested these tanks were effectively obsolete in modern tank-to-tank warfare, better suited for static defensive roles than frontline assaults. So it took less than a year for Russian strategists to move the goalposts from invade and capture the entirety of Ukraine to create a defensive line with old tanks to prevent the Ukrainian military from recapturing Donbass. And that wasn't all. The T-90, or its more advanced version, the T-90M, weren't supposed to be the pinnacle of Russian tank engineering. That honor, if we could call it as such, belongs to the T-14 Armata. However, the T-14 program ended up being plagued with issues. When the tank was initially designed and displayed in 2014, the Russian armed forces proudly announced it would source 2,300 of these tanks by 2020. This would give it a 2-year period to train its troops with the new tanks and devise strategies specific to the modernized vehicle. Instead, the estimate kept going down. By 2021, the estimated number of tanks was only 100 by 2025. That number was further dropped to more than 40 after 2023. Reports from 2023 showed footage of what looked to be a few T-14s in Ukraine, but even those last few vehicles seemed to have been pulled from the front line just a few weeks later. Initial claims of the tanks being sent to Ukraine were rebuffed instead of sending T-90s, which were much more economically viable. It's far more likely that Russia pulled the tanks from the front line to avoid the shame of losing the state-of-the-art machinery to ragtag Soviet-era tanks, donated obsoleting pieces from NATO, and modified commercial drones. And the Russian Air Force hasn't fared much better. Despite having one of the world's largest fleets of combat aircraft on paper, Russia has failed to establish air superiority over Ukraine. Why? Well, reports from NATO intelligence suggest that many Russian pilots receive only 50 to 100 training hours annually, compared to NATO's 180-hour minimum. They simply don't know how to effectively operate in contested airspace. Furthermore, the Air Force was designed to be directly supported and guided by Russia's land forces. Russian pilots would get targets from land operators on the front lines or from static defenses inside Russia, in the case of a defensive war, which was the more likely scenario according to Russia's military doctrine. Instead, with widespread equipment and logistical failures, Russian airplanes had nothing relevant to do. With a lack of training and sometimes even a lack of working GPS equipment, as shown by footage of planes strapping commercial GPS devices to the cockpit, the aircraft were relegated to sending long-range glide bombs, which had their own suite of issues and failures. The lack of military-industrial progress could be explained by the incredible strains on its economy, the lopsided effect of the Russian energy industry on domestic production, and corruption. Russia simply lacks the industrial capacity to mass-produce advanced systems. Western sanctions have severely restricted Russia's access to crucial microelectronics and other high-tech components. Reports indicate that Russian arms manufacturers have resorted to salvaging semiconductor components from consumer electronics like refrigerators and dishwashers to build military systems. Even before the invasion, Russia's economy was fraught with problems, with gas and oil exports making a large chunk of the country's revenue, in some cases approaching 50%. The energy industry has grown to the detriment of others, with available manpower plummeting to account for the industry's growing salaries and job openings. At the same time, the exorbitant casualties that Russia has faced, losing an estimated 783,000 soldiers between 2022 and 2025, including over 170,000 killed and hundreds of thousands permanently disabled, alongside the emigration of nearly 900,000 people, have pushed the country toward unprecedented labor shortages. While not all of the wounded were incapacitated, the sheer scale of deaths, disabilities, and brain drain has contributed to rising unemployment and a shrinking workforce that threatens to undercut Russia's long-term economic and military resilience. Yet despite this growing crisis, Russian government officials have issued repeatedly contradictory data on workforce gaps and demographic trends, suggesting an active attempt to obscure the severity of the problem and preserve the Kremlin's wartime narrative. Russia's lack of military might goes beyond technological and equipment downfalls from a lack of industry. The tactics that the military use are considered insane at some points. Military analysts have documented Russian units conducting frontal assaults across open terrain against prepared Ukrainian positions, a strategy called human wave attacks. The resulting casualties have been staggering. In some sectors, Russian forces have suffered near-complete casualties of entire battalions, leading to severe demoralization and a lack of overall manpower in the army, which only fueled future failures. Even more shocking has been Russia's failure to effectively coordinate combined arms operations, the integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. This is Military Operations 101, a basic skill that professional armies mastered decades ago, or at least should have done. Instead, what we're seeing are Russian tanks operating without infantry support, making them easy prey for Ukrainian anti-tank teams. We've seen Russian infantry advancing without proper reconnaissance or fire support, and we've seen Russian artillery, supposedly their strongest asset, initially used for indiscriminate area bombardment rather than precision strikes. But over time, that strategy has begun to evolve. According to British military analysts, Russia is now shifting towards a mass precision approach, relying more heavily on precision-guided munitions for counter-battery fire. So what do all of these have in common? The short answer is lack of training and officer corruption. First, Russian generals have had to position themselves dangerously close to the front lines because their troops simply cannot operate effectively without direct supervision. This speaks volumes about the lack of initiative and training among junior non-commissioned officers. The CNA, or Center for Naval Analyses, provided an extensive report of Russia's armed forces training, outlining several problems all the way back in 2009 that were not fixed by the time the invasion came. For example, a long-standing problem in the army is the separation between contracted and conscripted soldiers. This is further exacerbated by a lack of standardization in training, as each Russian unit conducts in-house training with no countrywide standards or reporting requirements. The CNA suggested that a few officers were previously fired for overstating their successes. Mind you, this was before the war in Ukraine, but there seems to be no improvement in that regard, at least according to how the invasion turned out. The CNA put the bulk of the issue on Russia's rigid military infrastructure, doctrine, and training regimes. The officers are trained to obey orders from their superiors, and combat training is conducted using predetermined missions and objectives rather than dynamic responses. The vertical nature of Russian command has created a military unable to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. While Ukrainian forces demonstrate agility and decentralized decision-making, Russian units often wait for orders from above, creating fatal delays in the fast-paced modern battlefield. Without supervision and direct backing from officers, Russian soldiers broke rank. When ambushed, most Russian conscripts simply surrendered. The aforementioned human wave tactics that led to the staggering losses, captured soldiers claimed that they were forced to advance or would have been shot by their own commanders. The extent of mismanagement and lack of training came to a head in August 2024 when Ukraine managed to mount a counter-invasion into Kursk, which contained waves of Russian conscripts surrendering to incoming Ukrainians, citing a lack of training, preparedness, or even actual orders from the upper officers. Second, Russia's secure communication systems have failed so spectacularly that high-ranking officers have resorted to using unsecured phones, making them vulnerable to Ukrainian intelligence and precision strikes. And those same officers spent years trying to skirt the rules and regulations of the military. On paper, Russia's pre-war military budget hovered between $60 and $70 billion, far less than the combined spending of NATO countries. So where did it all go? Into the pockets of corrupt officials and generals. And if recent reports are any indication, that hasn't changed one bit. Transparency International ranks Russia among the most corrupt countries in the world. This corruption permeates every level of the military establishment, from procurement officers accepting bribes to approve substandard equipment, to unit commanders selling fuel and supplies on the black market, to defense contractors delivering hollow shells instead of functional weapon systems. Investigations by independent media outlets revealed shocking examples: non-existent ghost soldiers whose salaries went to the commanders, military construction projects that existed only on paper, and maintenance contracts for vehicles that hadn't run in years. This systematic corruption has hollowed out Russia's military capabilities from within. You can't build an effective fighting force when everyone in the chain of command is skimming from the top. Worse yet, as casualties mounted in Ukraine, the Russian military faced a severe manpower shortage. Their solution, the Wagner Group, led by the now deceased Yevgeny Prigozhin, began recruiting directly from Russian prisons, offering pardons in exchange for 6 months of service. These convicts, many serving sentences for violent crimes, received minimal training before being sent to the front lines. Reports indicate some received as little as 1 week of preparation before combat deployment. The results were predictably catastrophic, with Wagner commanders using these prison recruits as disposable soldiers in those same human wave attacks to reveal Ukrainian positions. And even those few standards that were accentuated by the CNA previously seem to have fallen. The partial mobilization announced in September 2022 saw men with no military background given obsolete equipment and sent to Ukraine with less than a month of training. That same report claims that conscripts who were once in the army were unlikely to receive refresher training at all. Compare this to NATO standards, where basic infantry training takes months, followed by specialized unit training. The disparity in preparation is stark and reflects a fundamental disregard for the value of Russian soldiers' lives. In desperation, Russia deployed North Korean soldiers to fight alongside Russian forces in Kursk, with estimates going above 10,000 soldiers. Additionally, Russia has recruited mercenaries from Syria, Libya, and the Central African Republic to bolster its forces. This is not the behavior of a great military power. It's the desperate move of a country unable to achieve its objectives with its own forces. The deployment of North Korean troops is particularly telling. North Korea, one of the world's poorest and most isolated countries, is not known for its military excellence or advanced training. That Russia would turn to such allies speaks volumes about the state of its own military manpower. To add insult to injury, those North Korean troops ended up being withdrawn only 3 months later, after reports cited over 3,000 casualties. Though Pyongyang later sent more troops to replace them, the damage was already done. Russia's attempts to boost its front lines with foreign reinforcements had backfired spectacularly. But let's zoom out and look at the big picture. What were Russia's strategic objectives in Ukraine? Primarily, they sought to 1. Prevent NATO expansion, 2. Demonstrate Russia's great power status, and 3. Secure a friendly buffer state on their western border. Have they achieved any of those objectives? Quite the opposite. Finland and Russia have joined NATO, dramatically expanding the alliance's border with Russia, whose military reputation has been shattered, revealing weaknesses that embolden rather than intimidate rivals. And Ukraine is more firmly aligned with the West than ever before, with billions in military aid transforming it into a formidable anti-Russian bulwark. The Kremlin has had to repeatedly shift the benchmark of the invasion. As mentioned, the invasion was supposed to last only a few days. In April 2022, the new strategy ended up being to capture Ukraine through Donbass. Nearly 3 years later, the Institute for the Study of War reported, Russian forces failed to break Ukraine despite expending tremendous military, human, and economic resources to multiple offensive efforts. The institute suggested that Russia resorted to leveraging pretty much every aspect of its military, rather than using only advanced equipment and special forces, and still was unable to make a meaningful dent, with most of the front lines moving negligibly throughout the entire year 2024. The consensus is brutally clear. Russia's military has underperformed even the most pessimistic pre-war assessments. Given these profound and systemic problems, what does the future hold for Russia's military? The short-term prognosis is grim. Russia has depleted much of its modern equipment, expended massive amounts of ammunition, and lost many of its best-trained personnel. Even if the Ukraine conflict ended tomorrow, Russia would require years, if not decades, to rebuild its conventional forces. This rebuilding effort will be hampered by Western sanctions that restrict access to critical technologies, a struggling economy unable to sustain massive military spending, and a demographic crisis that limits the pool of potential recruits. More fundamentally, Russia would need to undertake painful reforms to address the cultural and structural problems that have been exposed. This would mean confronting entrenched corruption, overhauling the command structure to empower junior officers, modernizing training methods, and fostering a culture that values honest assessment over face-saving deception. Given the nature of the current Russian political system, such reforms seem unlikely. More probable is a cosmetic reorganization that preserves the underlying dysfunctional system. This doesn't mean Russia isn't dangerous. A wounded bear is often the most dangerous kind, and Russia retains significant capacity to inflict harm, particularly through its nuclear arsenal and its willingness to target civilians and infrastructure. But what do you think? Is Russia capable of regaining its military power and structure, or are there problems too entrenched to solve in the near future? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you, as always, for watching. Now go and check out why Russia's navy sucks, or click this other video instead.